Can we start? Okay, so
let me just grab my video. Okay. Am I visible, clear? Everything is good?
Yes.
Okay.
So, good morning, everyone. So, as you all know, that Africa Day is commemorated every 25th May to mark the progress made by African countries towards freedom from oppressors and colonizers. For this year, the theme of Africa Day is arts, culture, and heritage, levers for building the Africa we want. As we ponder over Africa Day and what it means to Africans, us, often due to a colonial legacy, with lingers, the notion of what is African and young African often intrigues us. The rhetoric is scary. Male domination, corruption, poverty, war, and being a homogeneous community are often the misconceptions about what is African. With regard to LGBTQ people, the rhetoric is a bloody one. The homosexuality is un-African, important, and does not form part of African history and culture. Yet, prior to colonization, the rich culture showed that throughout the African continent, there were no more relaxed attitude towards LGBTQ people. So, as a matter of fact, the tombs of two men bodies embracing as lovers. Many ancient Egyptian deities were often androgyne or of a third gender. In Angola, many were wives. Some tribes in Nigeria and Ghana did not assign gender to babies at birth and waited until later life to assign genders. And in royal palaces in northern Sudan, daughters were sometimes given slave girls for sex. Well, despite the diversities of identities in African culture, out of the 54 countries, African countries, around 33 have laws criminalizing homosexuality, greatly due to imported colonialism. So, however, while on one side the political discourse remained violently homophobic in many African countries, there have been progress for LGBTQ people, I must say. So, Angola signed into a law revised penal code allowing same-sex relationships and forbidding discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Gabon reversed a law that criminalized homosexuality. Botswana High Court also decriminalized homosexuality in 2019. And Mozambique and Seychelles have scrapped anti-homosexuality laws. South Africa is often seen as a leader in LGBTQ rights on the continent, I must say. It banned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and in its constitution in 1998, anti-discrimination laws were further extended to protect sexual minority rights in the workplace. And in 1926, marriage equality became a reality for all, and therefore granting LGBT couple the same rights as heterosexual sexual couples. In Mauritius, there have been many advances, namely the right for LGBTQ people to organize and assemble, non-discrimination and equal opportunities in society, and blood donation rights. It's criminalized. Trans people are not recognized and marriage equality is not yet achievable. So the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has confirmed that equality of treatment should be irrespective of sexual orientation. Although the African Commission on Human and People's Rights statement are not binding, they show that it has become a forum for the advancement of LGBTQ people in Africa. However, the independence of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is not protected against political pressure from the African Union member states. So, thank you for your attention, and I hope that we are going to have a great discussion on Africa, on LGBT rights across Africa, and that I hope we may do something great in the context of the Africa Day, and looking forward for a fruitful discussion with you all. Thank you. Now I present you Ms. Thiruna Naidoo. She's from the Center of Human Rights. So I leave the floor to her.
Okay, thank you very much, Lakshita. So good afternoon, everyone. Happy Africa Day. Thank you very much for having me here. I think it's very important to have this discussion in the context of Africa Day, specifically because LGBTIQ plus rights across the continent are contentious issues, with some states criminalizing LGBTIQ plus people, jailing them, and against these people. So yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to go over like a quick presentation, and I'd like this to be an engaging session. So I think one thing we know is that many people in Africa continue to suffer all forms of discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. A number of these people may identify publicly or privately as LGBTIQ+, but in many cases they do not. So while in some countries there has been significant legal progress to protect LGBTIQ plus persons, or to at least decriminalize homosexuality, like you've mentioned in Angola recently, in Gabon, there's still many challenges throughout the continent, and it remains generally unsafe for most Africans to expressly disclose that they are in same-sex consensual relationships or are attracted to other people of the same gender. And these challenges and violations will be considered like across a spectrum of issues. So the first starts off with criminalizing and discriminatory laws. So the state itself creates this legal environment in which LGBTIQ plus identities are not seen to be part of the general population. They're seen to kind of be like illegal citizens, under the law. The second is violence. So different forms of violence, either perpetrated by people acting on the part of the state, or private individuals who are trying to regulate or correct in some way the identities of people who are expressing themselves in a non-heteronormative, non-cisgendered way. Other issues also include arbitrary arrest and detention, blackmail and extortion, as well as attacks on LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders. So these may also not necessarily be LGBTIQ plus persons themselves, but organizations working for LGBTIQ plus rights can be targeted. Online attacks, hacking of emails, hacking of websites, and also sometimes allies who speak on behalf of the community or try to open up spaces to be more open to LGBTIQ plus rights can face resistance just for being allied to LGBTIQ plus rights and the LGBTIQ plus rights movement in Africa. So I think just to backtrack a little bit, it's very important to understand key concepts and terminologies. So ending violence and discrimination against persons in Africa on the basis of their real or imputed sexual orientation and gender identity requires an engagement from people who work in human rights institutions to understand concepts of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. So the problem starts with the construction of language around LGBTIQ plus identity. So stigmatizing words create negative stereotypes against LGBTIQ plus persons, which can be used in everyday language, in like the normal language of a country, or in like vernacular dialects. Which can then lead to those stereotypes, which then fosters like a culture of intolerance against LGBTIQ plus persons. So I think like, it's very important to understand the need for using terminology that is inclusive, terminology that places the person's self-identification first, and that's where we start to kind of like unpack, how do we bring LGBTIQ plus rights into the focus in the Africa, having the language so that, there's proper visibility, there's this understanding of like, when we talk about people on the spectrum of gender and sexuality, we use the language that is used by people who identify, and I think that, this kind of then starts to break down some of those negative stereotypes that have been deeply ingrained into traditional structures, into legal systems, into the way people interact with queer people around them, So I think that, some of the key concepts and terminology that you would need to know is that when we talk about the community as a large, we lump all of the identities together, but there are people who have a specific sexuality or sexual orientation, and that speaks about who you're attracted to. So it speaks about your relationships with other people. And then there are people who might be heterosexual in nature, they're attracted to people of the opposite gender, but the way they specifically identify and the way they specifically present their gender to the world is different to what people perceive it to be. So this could be trans people, gender non-conforming people, non-binary people. They all have an understanding of their gender identity that is specific, but people will try and contest on the basis of the sex assigned at birth. And the difference between sexuality issues and gender identity and expression issues is that with your sexuality, it's your relationships with others. And it's the behavior between you and someone else that the state will like criminalize. Whereas with your gender identity, it's your self-expression of your gender. And it's a personal thing. It's about you, yourself, and your body and how you present yourself to the world. So this kind of like opens up the challenge where people who are non-cis, so trans people, gender non-conforming people, non-binary people, are perceived to be homosexuals, and homosexuality itself is perceived to be a crime in many places. And because of that, like often violence targeted against the community doesn't discriminate, in the sense that the less heteronormative you appear to be, the more at risk you are to forms of violence perpetrated by private individuals or the state. So I think like to kind of just give you a little bit of a background on like the human rights system. In the global human rights systems, the United Nations human rights treaty bodies are universally applicable to all. So they have a system and a legal framework of rights, and all of the big parts of this, the core treaties and instruments, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant of social, economic, and cultural rights constitute the foundational documents of the global human rights system. And these documents continue to be the most important basis for the protection of human rights universally throughout the globe. And it's emphasized in Article 2 of the Universal Declaration, which states that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration: sex, language, religion, political, or same, and it's this or other status that kind of leaves the list to be open-ended, so that you can kind of read in rights for people who haven't been specifically mentioned in the document. Because we also need to remember that these things were drafted at a different point in time when there were different issues that were prevalent and needed to be addressed in society. And we know that the LGBT to the early 1900s, there's been visibility that started, but I think this coordinated global resistance really started gaining more momentum towards the 60s onwards, and even then it was still very fractured. We now live in this digital age where we're very well connected and can communicate, and I know what's going on on the other side of the world, and but literally 25 years ago, it wasn't that easy. You wouldn't know that New York and there's going to be a protest in London, so we can organize one in solidarity in Pretoria as well. So I think those are some of the things to think about. So this global framework emphasizes the necessity of equality, universality, and non-discrimination in the application of human rights to all people, which means that LGBTIQ+ persons are included. We're not a separate category of people. We are people who just identify differently when it comes to our personal relationships with other people or our gender identity and expression. So this need for equality, it doesn't have to expressly include us, because we know as normal people, we are included, And I think, that's one of the challenges sometimes, is that people feel because there's silence, it means that LGBTIQ+ persons are excluded. And to some extent, it's about the culture of the organizations that implement these human rights programs that are designed to bring to fruition different human rights goals, based on the principles that exist. But if you take a proactive approach and you take an LGBTIQ+ approach in your programming, where you are inclusive, where you are aware, where you actively try and engage with LGBTIQ+ issues, you are still working for human rights. So I guess to kind of move on, within the African system, the African human rights systems are principally governed by the provisions of the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. And it was adopted on June 27 in 1981 and came into effect in 1986. So it's still relatively new. African Children's Charter. And the African Commission on Human and People's Rights interprets and monitors the implementation of the Charter. So the preamble of this charter states that freedom, equality, justice, and dignity are essential objectives for the achievement of the legitimate aspirations of the African peoples, and that fundamental rights stem from the attributes of human beings. So Articles 2 and 3 of the Charter guarantee all individuals freedom from discrimination and equal protection and equality of individuals under the law, respectively. And Article 2 specifically states that every individual shall be entitled to the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms recognized and guaranteed in the present Charter without distinction of any kind, such as race, ethnic group, color, sex, language, religion, political, or any other opinion, national and social origin, fortune, birth, or other status. And in different communications over time, the African Commission has expressed that other status can include grounds other than those specifically stated in the text of the African Charter. So that phrase, other status, like I mentioned previously, is very important because although sexual orientation is not expressly stated, the use of the phrase other status in the limits that are guaranteed in the African Charter are for the enjoyment of all individuals, including LGBTIQ plus persons in Africa. And the African Commission actually noted in a specific case that the aim of Article 2 is to ensure equality of treatment for individuals, irrespective of their nationality, sex, racial or ethnic origin, political opinion, religion or belief, disability, age, or sexual orientation. So there is this kind of understanding that the Charter also should provide for LGBTIQ plus rights, if you read it in that way. And the Commission's autonomy and independence has continued to be threatened by political arms and processes, which I think is one of the challenges. So to come back to kind of like the core of this discussion, we know that like different states take different approaches. I mean, we have countries that have decriminalized, like Botswana, Angola, Gabon, amongst many others. South Africa itself as well decriminalized in 96. But just decriminalizing is only the start. You still have to then go forward and bring into effect legislation that will provide for substantive equality. In the way you approach LGBTIQ plus rights, you need to create an environment, a legal environment that allows for people to be included in all parts of society. So when you think about that, you need to think about what are the specific access to healthcare issues that LGBTIQ plus people experience? So one I can think of is that trans people specifically need gender-affirming healthcare services. But if your healthcare system doesn't understand that there are trans people in our society, they don't then create a program that allows for trans people to at least be connected with doctors and other healthcare professionals that can give them this gender-affirming healthcare services, or in their treatment, they understand if someone is on hormone replacement therapy, I need to be careful about giving them certain types of medication that can counteract, the HRT that they're on. So I think that, even though we have places that have decriminalized, and even in my country itself, in South Africa, we have brought in other forms of like law to try and integrate LGBTIQ plus people into society, you still see high rates of violence against LGBTIQ plus persons, and that kind of like comes back to the question of what is the state's approach to inclusivity, and then what more are the challenges in places where the state is not even open to the topic of LGBTIQ plus rights. I mean, you have politicians like who are contesting elections on a national level in places who will say that these people don't exist. They don't exist here. We don't have gay people in Zambia. We don't have gay people in Egypt, But you'll find that there are these people in these countries, but they just don't have access to any form of protection. So they have to then, be more under the radar, be less visible, so that they can escape threats to their personal safety. So there are many challenges that stem from the political will of people who are placed in governments, as well as other challenges in societies. So when we think of some countries are governed according to religious core values. So Islamic states take a specific approach. Zambia, as our only really leading Christian state, also takes a specific approach. And in that, like, there isn't room for negotiation, because they feel like if this text holds this, we cannot even question, that in the legal arena, So despite these challenges, the African Commission, at least, has kind of expanded its views on LGBTIQ plus persons. So it has called on states to revoke discriminatory laws targeting LGBTIQ plus persons in order to comply with state obligations under the African Charter. And Resolution 275 of the African Commission, which is the resolution on protection against violence and other human rights violations against persons on the basis of their real or imputed sexual orientation or gender identity, was adopted at the 55th Ordinary Session, which was in 2014. So why that's an interesting resolution, other than the fact that, like, it's groundbreaking in its nature, and it calls for the protection against violence and other human rights violations, is that it also recognizes that often when violence is committed against LGBTIQ plus persons, there isn't a check system where someone will come up to you and be like, oh, are you lesbian? Okay, because you're lesbian, I'm going to commit this act of violence against you. There is often violence that is meted out without any confirmation, because you'll not know for sure. Like, and that's why the imputed part is real. So people who are perceived to be queer or perceived to be LGBTIQ plus in some way, the perpetrators themselves won't be able to specifically identify and say, yes, I did this to this person because, they specifically are this person, this orientation or this identity. It will be just because that they are behaving outside of what they see to be conventional norms under the heteropatriarchal system that they have been brought up in, and that they feel that everyone has to comply with. So this resolution centralizes the protection of LGBTIQ plus persons, which is important because it speaks a lot about the Commission's approach to the interpretation of human dignity, which expects that states will not interfere in the private lives of citizens. So concluding observations by the African Commission, which are relevant, I think, is that the African Commission also issues concluding observations to protect the rights of LGBTIQ plus persons and to raise awareness on SOGIESC issues in Africa, and also highlight positive outcomes on SOGIESC issues in national systems. So some of these are considered in the following examples. So I just pulled up Mauritius as an example. So in its concluding observations in the 2nd to 5th reports, covering 1995 to 2008, the Commission commended the state for adopting the Equal Opportunities Act 2008, which prohibits discrimination on the grounds of age, caste, color, creed, ethnic origin, impairment, marital status, place of origin, political opinion, race, sex, and sexual orientation. So I do think that, we are in a challenging environment where advocating for human rights is difficult, in the African environment. But when it comes to the rights of marginalized persons, people from marginalized communities, such as the LGBTIQ plus community, it's difficult because you're often facing different forms of resistance, So for some people, it's a personal issue that they just feel as if like, oh, I don't understand queer people. I don't understand what rights do they need. I mean, if they exist, what do they need? And then other people, it will be like on a religious basis that like, because I believe in this understanding of religious identity, because I believe in these religious values. And this is what I perceive my religion to say about queer people. This is why I will not agree and I will not support any movement for the rights of LGBTIQ plus people. And for other people, I mean, there's a whole host of reasons. Some of it is being cited as, no, if you're part of a more traditional community that centralizes like traditional values, and I'm sure you've heard the phrase traditional African values. I mean, Africa is such a big place, such a big continent. There are so many people from different tribes, different ethnic backgrounds. You know, what is an African value, a traditional African value? We cannot essentialize, you know, a whole extended diverse population and bring them down to like one kind of like understanding, cultural understanding, you know. So I think, like, you know, it's difficult for people in the human rights space, but I think it's very important to note that if you want to work for LGBTIQ plus rights, you don't necessarily have to be an activist. You don't necessarily have to be like, okay, well, I am going to make sure I go to law school and become a lawyer. I mean, those things are great and important and necessary as well. But I think for everyday people, you need to start challenging and questioning heteronormativity in your environments, you know. So it literally starts in your house, it starts in your school, it starts in your communities, and it's about decentralizing heteronormative cultures in your spaces. You know, it's about opening up space for inclusivity that is not about tolerance, but rather about celebrating diversity. And I think a large part of that will be done through representation, but it also has to come from like culture shifts, like institutional culture shifts, you know. So it's not necessarily that like, okay, well, if we hire one trans woman, we're done, you know. It's about making sure you have a proper understanding of what are the specific issues affecting trans people in my community, not just trans people across the world, you know, because people in your community will have their own identity, their own set of issues that they'll be facing. Yes, some of those can be general and some of those can be relatable to people in other contexts, but I think it's very important to bring in an understanding of how you interact with your environment when you're working to include people as well. So I think that's my short presentation. If you have any specific questions or any comments, please do let me know. I understand we're live streaming on Facebook, so I think Lakshita will read out any comments that are coming in at this point.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much for this very fruitful discussion, this fruitful presentation, I must say. It was filled with many information. I am pretty sure that our viewers are getting a more insight about the African continent, about what is the African values. We know, we understand that Africa, we have many ethnic groups. It's our culture. Then, you know, as you said, when it comes to LGBTQ rights, it comes along religious beliefs, freedom of expression, and then freedom of religious, yes. So I think being a very diverse continent with many groups, maybe some countries, they face some kind of obstacles for the proper protection and promotion of LGBT rights. So I think through advocacy, through active citizenship, I'm pretty sure that we are going to have a very an equal world together, and united Africa, that no one is left behind. So I think let me check. The first question that we have is yes. So what is your reading on this expression? Homosexuality is un-African.
Mm. Okay, so should I answer that question or take a few more and then?
Okay, I can. We have around, for now, we have 7 questions. So I give you 3, and then
Okay.
okay. So the first one is what is your reading on this expression? Homosexuality is un-African, and then what are the main challenges LGBTQ people face in Africa? So I think you've mentioned it earlier about discrimination, violence, arbitrary others. So I think you can just add something if ever something crop up again. And then we have also um, what can be done to stop those dialects or language that is discriminatory against the LGBTQ people?
Okay. I think I can take the first one and then move to the second one. Is that fine?
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay, fine.
Okay. So the phrase homosexuality is un-African is it's actually a comment that was made by homophobic leaders, and I think the person who kind of popularized the saying the most was Zimbabwe's former president Robert Mugabe, who said that homosexuality is un-African, and it's an imported concept coming from the West, which I think is very to pre-colonial Africa. In pre-colonial Africa, there are many documented instances of sexual and gender. So there were places like there were instances of like women taking wives, so if you are an heir, you can take a wife to bring a child into your family so that you have another heir, even if you're a woman in like the Bapedi tribe. And there are also other instances of like men taking boy wives, trans people like being documented. And it was only at the advent of colonialism, when the colonial invasion project began, that laws were brought in that actually then start to tackle unnatural, what the colonizers saw were unnatural sexual practices. So the English specifically, who came in, like a lot of their law was structured around these unnatural sexual practices, and sodomy, so anal sex, was a crime. And those laws still persist on many countries' statute books at this point. The English law, and even through independence movements, these are things that have stayed in like penal codes that have been a challenge to LGBTIQ plus people, because these are the laws that kind of give rise to the idea that between queer people are seen to be illegal, but it's the person themselves that is perceived to be illegal, that you cannot be gay. A gay person cannot exist in this space, So even if you are, for example, like a queer person who has no sexual history, who doesn't engage in any form of sex with other people at all, like you could still kind of be seen as this person who is violating the law, because people don't understand how these laws were actually designed and how they were meant to be implemented, but they also shouldn't be implemented anyway. I think the challenge is that the perception is that homosexuality was imported. It came in when settlers came into different parts of Africa, but there's no evidence that it began after colonization began, that we started to see LGBTIQ plus people after. In pre-colonial times, these, as well. Like, I think that's another thing. And I think that to say that it's un-African is just completely baseless, because how do you kind of like completely erase that history of like queer people who existed before, and it also kind of takes a very it takes a very strange approach, in that like one person or people of a specific elite group holding some form of power can then define what it means to be African. If we are all African people, all people born on the African continent, like, who can say what it is to being African? Like, so I think, that's what I think about that statement. And a lot of people believe it, and it's a very easy thing to say that, oh, homosexuality is un-African, so I don't agree with it. But you need to actually interrogate, where does that come from? What is the agenda behind statements like that? And what is the reality, because we have the historic evidence. And we also have an understanding of like when colonization happened, when it began to happen, the approach, was very specific in the way specific behaviors were criminalized, specific relationships were criminalized. It's a power dynamic that doesn't just only like apply to LGBTIQ plus people. People of color throughout the continent suffered at the hands of colonialism, and the way they constructed society, we are still dealing with it today. Although there has been independence in many places, although people have reformed their legal systems, reformed their constitutions, tried to transform the approach to law and regulating society, but we still face many challenges because we haven't recovered yet from those colonial systems that were created in order to oppress people across different spectrums. Yeah, and the second question was about how do we move to using better language? I think on that point, it's very important for us within the community to identify our language. And I think for yourself, the language you use for yourself, that is the language that will be the most important when you are talking about yourself. But sometimes the language may not always apply to other queer people, So I think, it starts with really us self-identifying and being able to communicate to people that like, oh, for me, this is what it's about. Because I think some of the issues as well is that when people think you're queer, when you come out as queer, like the first thing that goes through everyone's mind is like, oh my God, you're having some type of sex with someone, when that often isn't the case. It's an identity thing, and it's an understanding of what you're attracted to and who you're attracted to and why. So I think we need to kind of bring in those finer nuances of understanding that like people are complex beings. The things we're interested in and the things we're attracted to can change a lot, but when someone specifically has a sexual orientation that is non-heteronormative, it's important to kind of respect their right to use specific language to themselves. So I know one of the in-community challenges we have is that there's often mistrust by monosexual identities. So people who are attracted to only one gender or sex. So for example, like women who are attracted to women only, or men who are attracted to men only, monosexual people, have a mistrust for people who have plural sexual attractions. So for example, those are your bisexual people or your queer people who are interested in like your pansexual people who are interested in multiple gender identities and expressions and are open to really just meeting the person, and not worrying about the form that they come in. And that kind of mistrust also then creates this culture of misunderstanding what it means to be queer. I think, that's one of the challenges we have. Sometimes we work against ourselves in the way that we do not have a united front. So how do we expect other people to fight for us if we're not fighting as much as we can for ourselves and we're fighting within our community? So I do think that, on the language front, it will take a long time to transform and to get to a point where we have cohesive language that's available. But I think people also have to do research. That's unfortunately what it is. You do have to equip yourself with knowledge. You do have to do that work to go and gain access to the right language and language that will help you better understand rights. And I think it's very important to understand that as a queer person yourself, the onus is not on you to teach everyone around you about your identity. Anyone who's a part of your life that affirms you and respects you and tries to promote your equality should also be willing on their own to do the same type of research that you do. For many of us, when we were coming out and coming to terms with understanding what our sexual orientation or gender identity and expression really means for ourselves, we also had to understand, we also had to do research, we also had to try and find people to get an understanding of if I think I'm lesbian, what is being lesbian about? What is lesbian culture? Are there any people I know who might be lesbian, any famous people I can look at, any celebrities? Are there any TV shows I can watch with lesbian characters to see how different women can be lesbian, So I do think that people in your life also need to be proactive in that respect. And that's why, for myself, I believe that LGBTIQ plus rights should be promoted through advocacy work. It is the work of institutions that will really bring social integration for LGBTIQ plus people in society. It is not about the individual activist fighting for rights for the community. The individual can only do so much, but institutions themselves, they have a social responsibility towards creating and fostering that inclusion and that integration that will ultimately break down social structures that prevent LGBTIQ plus people from becoming a proper part of society, from becoming visible. That's what will help protect people, in the long run from forms of discrimination and violence. Okay, I think we can take other questions.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much. So the next question is, I think you have already answered it. It's about what proactive approaches that the government can take to include LGBT community. So I think you have already mentioned about institutions, social responsibility, and then do you want to add something more on this?
Yeah, so I think, on the part of the state's primary responsibility is to develop policies and programs that will improve the lives of citizens. So I think from the highest level of government, from the executive, all the way down to your local municipal office, there should be an approach that is LGBTI inclusive in policy formulation as well as policy implementation. So it's very important. So it's not just about, bringing the right laws in place, bringing the right policies in place, which will try and affirm LGBTIQ plus rights, but it's also about the way that they are implemented, and that is the challenge I am seeing in my country today, where in South Africa, we have an extensive legal framework that exists. We have extensive legal provisions surrounding LGBTIQ plus rights. We have specific documents that were created literally just to ensure that we have some form of marriage equality. We have some form of ability, we have the ability to alter our sex description on our national documents. But even though we have these things, you'll find that when you go to department offices and you try to alter your sex descriptor, or you and your partner go and you try and apply for a same-sex marriage, it's public officials who are refusing to officiate these things. So although the law is there, the implementation is failing because the institution itself does not hold people accountable when they turn down LGBTIQ plus citizens. Public officials do not have a fear of like, oh, well, if I tell the same-sex couple I'm not marrying them, they know they're still keeping their job, they're still getting their salary, they're still getting their benefits. Like, any official complaint against them will not be investigated, it will not be reported on, they will not face any hearing about their conduct, there won't be any misconduct investigation. So I think, that's a very specific challenge. And I think it's important for all levels of government to not just create policy, but to ensure checks and balances for implementation. And I think another thing is that although we are speaking about a specific community, we also need to contextualize ourselves within the discourse around other communities. So specifically, if a department, like say, I don't know if you have a department for women and children, they need to specifically have programming that also, when you are speaking about GBV, gender-based violence, you are also targeting gender-based violence that affects LBQ women. When you are speaking about children and you're speaking about ending bullying in schools, you must also make sure that one aspect of your campaign or your advocacy work around ending bullying includes LGBTIQ plus children. So there needs to be this multi-sectoral approach in terms of developing programs that are cognizant of the fact that, okay, maybe my GBV program is targeting a town of 2,000 people, right? And of those 2,000 people, maybe 1,600 are women. But they need to remember that of those 1,600 women, there are 300 queer women who are also at risk or vulnerable to gender-based violence. But because of their queerness, the factors that drive the gender-based violence that they'll experience, or the interactions they have with people who perpetrate gender-based violence, are a little different because they're non-heteronormative women, So I do think it's very important for programming to take an inclusive approach. And that really comes from people being willing on the state side to be like, okay, I know we are working on children's rights programs, but we need to think about LGBTIQ plus children as well, and I think that's one of the challenges. That's one of the challenges that we have across the board, wherever you are. It's very difficult to get people to do things that are outside the scope of their duties, specifically. So yeah, what was your second question? Sorry, I didn't catch that one.
The second question is about often it is observed that despite laws and the inclusion of LGBT people in legislations, hate crimes and stigma are persistent. Why is it so? And what can we do to overcome these challenges?
Okay, so I think, I can speak from the context of South Africa, specifically in terms of this one. So like I mentioned just now, we have extensive legal protection. And one of the specific things we're actually asking for, one of the last pieces of legislation we want is a bill that was drafted for the prevention and combating of hate crimes and hate speech to be passed. So the bill itself is broad in terms of that it's not just about LGBTIQ plus rights as well. It's hate speech on the basis of any grounds that is protected in our constitution, in our equality clause. So marital status, age, gender, whether you're pregnant or not, whether you have a disability or not, all of those things are included as well. So that's the last document we're asking for. And although we have many of these provisions in place and stuff, I think one of our challenges is that at the time when we included LGBTIQ plus people in our constitution, it wasn't a decision that was taken because majority of the population were in support of it. It was actually the opposite. Like very, very few people, like a very small minority of the population was in support of LGBTIQ plus rights. But the state believed, the people who drafted the constitution believed that if we bring in this protection for this group of people, over time, this will create an environment where LGBTIQ plus rights are respected and promoted, and we will be providing an opportunity for substantive equality through this. And I think the intention was good, but the challenge is that not enough work has been done around creating visibility and breaking stereotypes and fostering dialogues, intercommunity dialogues, in order to break down those resistant attitudes towards LGBTIQ plus persons, So I think the challenge of hate crime and violence comes from the fact that people believe that LGBTIQ plus rights shouldn't exist. So when they perpetrate violence against the community, they don't believe that I am perpetrating violence against a specific person or a group of people that are equal to me. So they believe in some way I am protected because this is not an equal citizen, but also they feel as if they are moral enforcers. They feel as if like I am cleansing society, or I am showing these people that they cannot be comfortable in our community with the way they are. And I think that sort of culture persists because there hasn't been work to really get people to reframe their understanding of gender and sexuality. And whatever is different to you will be perceived as a threat if you have no understanding and you haven't been conscientized around the fact that all people are equal and we all deserve access to the same rights, and you don't have the right to commit an act of violence against me if you don't agree with the way I identify, or if you don't agree with the types of relationships I have. If you're not in my personal relationship, if you're not in my pants, why is it hurting you? So I think that's where the challenge comes from.
Yes, thank you. So we have two last questions. So it is perceived that African countries often adopted UN resolutions or HIV-related programs, such as an African bloc. How far is it true when it comes to LGBTQ issue?
Sorry, so it's perceived that African countries have
often adopt UN resolutions or HIV-related programs, such as an African bloc.
I don't think I understand this question. Is the person available to perhaps maybe explain it a bit better?
I think it's basically about HIV-related programs in relation to LGBT community. So how the resolution adopted by the UN is true when it concerns LGBT issues. It's more about HIV-related programs to the LGBT community.
Yeah, so I think, the issue of HIV programming is that we understand that because like LGBTIQ plus people are a vulnerable population, at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, queer men, gay men specifically, or men who have sex with men but may not identify as like gay or queer, were specifically vulnerable because, access to protective means such as condoms and dental dams weren't as readily available. And I also think that, because there was less understanding around HIV and AIDS at that point, the epidemic really ravaged the queer community, and I think there was a specific need for HIV programming that understands that there are men who have sex with men and women who have sex with women who may not be using protection due to the power dynamics of the sexual interactions they're having, so it could be, some people are having illicit relationships, very brief sexual encounters with people, or are just having unsafe sexual practices because they have more than one partner. So for example, someone having a straight partner, so like someone that they're in a heteronormative relationship with. So for example, like a man who has married and has a wife, but also has a boyfriend, and he's having sex with two people at the same time, because he has to fulfill his marital duties as a husband, but he also has this other relationship on the side that he's having a relationship with someone that he's also having sex with. So those unsafe sexual practices, and I think just coupled with the lack of information, needed a specific response that centered an approach to recognizing that certain people are vulnerable, and we need to ensure that we kind of create support and create an infrastructure for providing for the specific needs of this marginalized community. So I do think that, a lot of the visibility around LGBTI people also came from these HIV programming and the HIV and AIDS movement. It really picked up on the fact that, queer people are vulnerable. But I know that in the beginning, a lot of it came from a form of resistance, and LGBTI people were blamed for bringing HIV/AIDS into the population. There were all these political issues, as there normally is. I mean, we get blamed for everything. But I think, it's very important to continue those programs, but also to recognize that that's just one aspect of healthcare access that people need. I mean, we really need to prioritize gender-affirming healthcare services, mental health for LGBTI people, and also reproductive, a rights-centered approach to reproductive health, especially for queer women who do not want to have children but are forced to keep their wombs, So I hope that has addressed.
Yes, I hope it addresses that question. And then lastly, so this one goes for this. It's for the center. It's regarding the center. Okay. So as we discussed last time, the Center for Human Rights is recognized internationally for excellence in human rights law in Africa, and then it is uniquely positioned as both an academic department and a non-governmental organization as well. So the question is, how is the Center for Human Rights supporting in advancing LGBTQ rights across Africa?
Okay, that's a great question. So the work we do at the center is interdisciplinary. In terms of one of our main focuses is on amplifying the work of Resolution 275. So we work across a regional level, and we engage the Commission as well as the African Committee for Children's Rights as well on different issues affecting the LGBTI community. We work with our partner organizations in order to host side events and to really amplify the need for the African human rights system to protect LGBTIQ plus persons. Also, we have different focuses. So we have a research element. We do academic research into specific issues affecting LGBTI people in Africa. And we look at advocacy work. So we run a few advocacy campaigns. We have an advocacy wing, and under that we sometimes run different campaigns, we host events, we foster dialogue, and we really unpack some of the issues affecting the community. And sometimes that can be done in creative ways as well. So outside of the academic infrastructure we have, we create documentaries, photo books, and really just have like cultural events as well that kind of like create an opportunity for people to engage with LGBTIQ plus rights, you know, and understand them better. And yeah, that's like a lot of the work we do here. And I think we take a proactive approach towards supporting other organizations as well, you know, so like on a local level as well, just, you know, participating and seeing what work is currently being done. You know, like we don't take the approach of like working directly with affected communities, but we work with finding ways to promote the rights of people, as well as how people can access better information to understand, you know, what LGBTIQ plus rights are and specific issues, as well as the African human rights infrastructure and how it can work for you, you know. Yeah, so that's kind of in a nutshell what we do here.
Okay, great. So I think we got enough question. I can't see more question right now. Do you want to add something or read the closing remarks?
Yeah. I think, you know, I just want to add that like it's very important for us, like as a community, to not just mobilize and organize around specific like community events. I think things like the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, as well as like other visibility days, are very important for our community. But opportunities that come through things such as Africa Day, like to South, are important because we need to move into the broader stream of society's consciousness in terms of that. Like we also celebrate Africa Day. Like we have queer Africans to celebrate. We have queer African subcultures, you know, to discuss and to look into. You know, we have African Pride, you know, and all of these things that are part of, you know, being African citizens, being African people. And I think it's very important to kind of bring that into the discourse of days such as this. And I think I also would like to say that it's very important to advocate for the rights of people, especially marginalized communities, you know. So whether you're a queer person yourself or an ally, it's important to equip yourself with the information you need to better work and to better create advocacy programs and campaigns that target creating awareness, positive visibility, and sharing action points for people to take, you know. So I think that's very important. And yeah, thank you very much for giving me this time today to speak about this topic. And if there are any questions, or if anyone is interested in the work that we do in the center, I will comment on the Facebook video a link to our website, and you can go through it and read some of the publications we have up. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for this fruitful discussion. As you mentioned that you wanted an engaging session, so I thank you. I hope it helps. And then just to add that since the beginning, we can see that there have been that we have many social challenges on the ground in Africa, and the social and legal challenges across the continent. So we basically we need more queer education and awareness on active citizenship, institution to have to be accountable and provide a social responsibility, definitely. So we as Africans, as advocate, ally, we have to position ourselves to show that we all deserve to thrive and contribute to the building of a prosperous continent. So the challenges may be large, maybe many and maybe large as well. Most importantly, when it comes to marginalized group, LGBT rights these days. So, but I can't help think back to many people who came before, who laid down their lives for us, to be at the point where we can continue today to fight for a global level. So I hope that on this Africa Day, we can remove these preventable obstacles and unlock the potential of people to live their fullest lives. Everyone live equally, and then as we stipulated Article 2 of the UDHR. So I hope this session has reached many people, and that it shall definitely help them in their day-to-day activism as well. So thank you very much, and happy Africa Day from the Young Queer Alliance to you and to the Center for Human Rights.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.